Some of us, unfortunately, some of us have already left because I had to catch the train, or but anyway, left. So we start our roundtable. Cristina will introduce the main themes that we have debated so far, and then she'll give us the possibility to ask questions to each other and interact until 12:30, basically.
You already have this possibility.
Yeah.
I will try to coordinate it in the best of my capacity. So when Alessandra proposed the main topic of this conference, the European Conference, in the eyes of the others, I was thinking which could be the general themes that would come about. And I was also trying to take notes in these days and trying to see which were the recurrent themes. So I will read my list and we're going to start one by one. Anybody can say anything, and if we see that the discussion really leads nowhere, we change topic. So I will try to coordinate that. First of all, I have thought of the principles, values and norms of European integration, the irreconcilable ones, the ones you never negotiate with, and because also sometimes the European community has made a trade-off of these values, norms, principles in exchange of some benefits, some commercial benefits, for example. So I wanted to know what are your views on that. Afterwards, we will talk about a very important topic like enlargement. Why do others want to be incorporated into the European communities? And also the question of widening and deepening as parameters for this process. So they see us interested enough to want to become members of our community. Then there's the question of immigration. How is Europe perceived in the eyes of other actors and other populations in the world, so that they want to move, sometimes leave everything, go through a lot of suffering and prejudice and stereotypes, and finally be part of the European community, live here to work, study, etc. Then we also have the question of special relations that came throughout this conference again and again. Also the post-colonial relations. After European colonialism and imperialism, there's a legacy, not always positive, of colonial relations, and how this is coming back, and how these former colonies are looking at European integration. Then we have the idea of defensive reaction, construction by doing something against Europe. We do that against Europe because we perceive Europe in that way, so defensive reactions. And also we have relation with the European foreign policy and so on. And then we have in the seventh place multilateral or bilateral relations. So either multilateralism, bilateralism towards the European community, and afterwards I have something that I call in Italian il terzo in discordia. And please don't get me wrong, it's just an innocent joke, because when we're talking about Japan, but also when I was working in Latin America, I saw this triangulation. We have the European community, we have, for example, Japan or Latin America, and we have the United States. So, which is the role, the eternal reference point, the role of the United States in shaping our relation with the rest of the world, and how the world perceives us because of our relation also with the United States. So the United States as it. And then instrumental relations, because that was also a common reference between this conference. There are many actors outside the European Union, but also on behalf of the European Union, we have relation with others depending on contextual interest. So if you are interested for us, yes, of course, everything we want, we're always available and interested, but this changes according to conference, context, agendas, domestic politics, etc. My final point, domestic politics as a perspective for international relations. So domestic politics in other countries, but domestic politics also within the European community, shaping international relations, and that's all. So let's start by this idea of principles, values, and norms of European integration that we would never negotiate with.
Yeah, I can add on that. I mean, you're thinking about the how the EU is thinking about developing, or is it everything in terms of democracy?
And also the exportation of democracy and
Okay.
our principles, translation of our models.
Because, well, from my point of view, from the people that I studied, this is kind of linked to many of the other stuff. But that's also a question of principle and value, because it's not about looking. They see that, well, these other countries are also, of course, democracies like us, but it's a tendency to see the Europe integration process as less democratic than the national. I think that's perhaps not very particular to Norway. There are some inherent problems there. Yeah. So I'll plan with that.
I'm a bit puzzled. There are these first topic and another one are, in my opinion, only related to candidate members, not entirely the others. Because, and I'll just stick to the first one. I mean, the other is just why they want to be incorporated. Not all the third countries wanted to be incorporated. So that is specifically should be specifically debated just for candidate members. But on principles, values, and norms, I didn't see any problem of the community or union to have deals with communist states. So once again, it depends if you are negotiating for membership or not. So everything might be negotiable, it seems, for the community, but its very existence and competence.
I was proposing that because I observed some specific cases, especially with Central American countries in some different periods. For example, it was used as a punishment. If you comply with these human rights, priority, etc., we will offer you this trade deal, and if you don't, we'll punish you.
The conditionality.
Exactly. Yeah, conditionality.
But communist countries never went that way. I mean, China is the biggest, most important. So, yeah, definitely. But I wonder whether this is, let's say, more a discourse, a rhetoric than an actual.
Or maybe it depends on countries that you have relations with. Sometimes you apply conditionality, and sometimes you don't.
And there are double standards.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
which is a possible answer to the point.
Yeah.
Perhaps they would stop.
I don't know the history of the EEC and the EU's relations with North Africa in great detail, but obviously this is a pressing issue now. I mean, some of the European states find themselves embarrassed before the revolutionary movements, trying to explain their policies and some of their trade deals towards these countries, particularly France with Tunisia, and the fall of the foreign minister as a consequence of that. So I don't know, that's just looking ahead from the headlines. But,
building on yours, I think like the European Union for the Mediterranean Sea actually failed. The idea was to give democracy to these countries through economy, but this didn't happen at all. Actually, most of the time, the aids were given to the party already governed. So you are not enhancing plurality, you are simply maintaining the status quo. But at the same time, the exports coming to those countries from the EU were increasing. So on the economic level, yeah, it was a success for the EU. At the democratic level for those countries, it was not. So even when the EU was actually acting in that, it wasn't really a great achievement, I would say.
I would like also something to say, something about Yugoslavia, but also a little bit further about Western Balkan. and actually about nowadays also. It seems to me that when I've read the documents and the secondary literature, that one of the goals, or one of the primary goals of the EC, or the Western powers actually in Yugoslavia, was to keep not only external but also internal stability. And they tried to achieve that mostly by economic means, by giving some economic beneficiaries to Yugoslavia until with agreements in 1970s and then with agreement in cooperation agreement in 1980. But as we all know, that the strategy didn't work actually, and but it was more because of the internal factors of Yugoslavia, not because of the EC policy, of course. But still, from 1995 to 1997, the EC has formulated the conditionality policy toward the Western Balkan, which was from then on pursued in the policy toward the Western Balkan. And I wanted to say, it seems to me that this, let's say, European model had done much more about stability of the region, it seems to me, than only the economic strategy which was pursued in the previous period. So I would argue like the let's say the European law as also as a factor of the way how to achieve stability in this region by forcing, or not forcing, by actually promoting the candidate countries to accept the principles, values and norms of the European community, European Union as a way to which is to break from this region.
Yeah, this reminds me of the conversation we had yesterday over lunch. Are we successful? Yeah, apart from Wales. But are we successful only when we enlarge? I mean, we mentioned failures in the Mediterranean area and in Western Balkans before accession. I mean, if our instruments are just economic measures, we don't go very far. We seem to be more successful through our enlargement, but we can enlarge to everybody. So yeah, I mean.
Yeah. So also this very explanation of the limits of the enlargement process. What do you think about it? Which are the final frontiers of this move? So Turkey.
Yeah, well, not only Turkey, but what if Ukraine and in that direction? I mean, where should it stop there? It's impossible to say. Of course,
yeah, everything is always like there. It's on the border. It seems to be always pushing east. Every a little bit more, which is not bad in itself, but I mean, we can do that just because that's the only instrument we have to promote democracy and stability.
It was once defined as we also said on lunch yesterday, as the only successful foreign policy of the European Union of enlargement. So why aren't we able to set other successful?
But if we exploit it, I mean, if we use it too much, the risk is that it will be like weakened. It won't be as successful as it has been.
On this, it's just coming out in my mind now. We have been successful in promoting democracy or securing democracy. Because actually, if we think about those enlargements involving these issues, the countries themselves had already started. So we just had a little bit. But, I mean, even the United States somehow have, some eastern countries, economically or whatever. So the prospect, the appealing membership, okay, if you reached a full democracy you're being, was in their way. They freed themselves. They started their valid revolutions, most valid. So they were on their path towards democracy, and so was Greece and Spain and Portugal. So the community stepped in, but it was not the principle, perhaps.
Maybe it made it faster, or
it was an incentive.
It was an accelerator, but not the reason. Otherwise, it sounds a little bit like the United States claiming to export democracy, whatever that means. And
Yeah, but we lead by example, that's what we
but I mean,
The idea.
seriously, it's the first time I think
Yeah.
about that, because I mean, it's a question of interpretation and rhetoric. But if you look from their point of view, they had already started the process of democratization, and this is perhaps the reason for failures of other areas, the Mediterranean, the North African states, or even the Western Balkans. Those who are not yet in the process of true democratization, we can't reach any successful story, or beginning of another story.
So we are always acting to reinforce, but we are not triggered.
Yeah, and I personally, this is my personal as a citizen or human being, I personally distrust one country or entity possibility to make up another country or nation, present and future. I mean, there are people involved, and they are the first answers.
It's also a question of not always what is the policy of the EU and how does it succeed. It's also a question of, I think this is becoming clearer during this discussion we had during this 2 days. The EEC, the EU is there, and it's growing, and it's becoming an actor more and more. And that is taken into account by the others. So increasingly, Japan has to see that, well, they are important. We have to do this. The other countries, with Latin America, sees that. The United States sees this, and it's not a question of if this and this policy is a failure or a success, because there are always all countries or states or organizations will have that aspect, but it's something that's even though the 70s is kind of crisis problematic period, there is this undercurrent, and there's nothing happening on the institutional level, but certainly all these other issues that we have been debating, there is something going on, and there's a growing awareness that the EEC, EU, of course, this continues into the 90s, and even though they say, well, we will have common foreign policy, and they never do, that's not always a crucial case, because it's also a matter of saying that, well, there's the EU, and we who are the small or the big countries around there have to adapt to that reality. Yeah. So that is also an element in this. So it's not only EU projecting things outside, but also the outside reacting or responding to what is going on.
What do you actually think from Japan nowadays about the growing visibility? The growing visibility of you as a law actor?
Yeah, just as I said, I mean, it's some responses. That's not always a good thing, because Japan is now puzzled, because the Koreans are so much aggressive in having the free trade FTAs, both with the United States and the EU, that happen to break loose the already severe competition of Japan, because we have to also free our markets, agriculture included, and that's a serious problem. And we're sort of blaming the EU, not the United States, but the EU probably for going so much far and too much quick for responding to something, that we thought that that's not going to happen, but that happened with Korea, which is now becoming a serious problem for Japan. So probably that reaction is, well, okay, necessary for the Europeans, but sometimes not really a good thing for a non-European. Yeah.
What about the view from the US?
What's the specific?
About the global role of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think still, and I actually don't remember her name right now, the foreign.
Catherine.
Yeah, exactly. Obama Sarkozy and Cameron, right? And the smaller states when he has to, perhaps you know what is.
Yeah, but I absolutely have the same feeling right now.
So we shouldn't, the U.S. expression, drink the Kool-Aid, right? Just because it's supposed to be, it isn't the case, right? I mean, there was I spoke to someone about this, I don't remember, there's a New York Times article recently, which actually made a completely wrong claim, which was that the U.S. was never interested in European integration. I studied in the late 40s and early 50s when, I mean, Truman and Eisenhower were extremely concerned about European integration. But it's probably somewhat true to in more recent periods that I don't study the 2000s, so I don't know exactly, this is impressionistic, but that it's kind of, from the government, the view is, well, good luck with that.
The Treaty of Lisbon made it even worse. They just can't understand what's going on.
Can we?
No, I mean, in a transatlantic perspective, it's even worse.
Okay, maybe when you want to go to the question of immigration, that is something that's changing really in other societies in Europe. And I don't know, talk from the point of view of Spain also, we were sending migrants and now we are receiving a lot, and you know, it is changing also society in many different ways. What is the case in your country is for the knowledge and your appreciations of this view from outside? And also the, the dreams and expectations that many populations put in this idea of Europe, paradise to be reached.
Don't want to always talk about failures, but if we take into account neo-functionalism, we believe that the spillover in the economic terms, we believe also a spillover in the political terms. In economic integration did not lead to a political integration, at least for the immigration. Therefore, thanks to the Schengen area, we can move around freely. However, everybody else who gets into the Mediterranean countries or from the east can move around freely as well. If we are talking about like criminal organizations or any other type of issue that could be even terrorism, this is extremely dangerous, and the EU didn't provide any solution for that. Everything that is in place is too small and too weak, from the trade organization to the Europol. Therefore, I think like it's another chance that the EU has to have power as a real civilian power, because in that case it can be. But if there are disputes among Italy and Malta about which one should host those immigrants, or there were at the moment bilateral agreements between Italy and Libya about immigrants. They were condemned by the United Nations, but Europe was like, we don't know what to do otherwise. So it's, and plus it's also another division among the Mediterranean countries and the northern countries that believe that are not that influenced by this issue. However, once you are inside, you can move freely. So.
And they definitely would not move.
Exactly.
I think there's also a question of double standards when we regard the European Union as a land of welfare state, and also some kind of living standards and conditions. But if we see all the exploitation that these people undergo and their living conditions, they are confronting these double standards within the European Union.
I think in Yugoslavia had a large migrant force in Germany especially, but in general in BC. This was actually a very complex question, and it started back in the mid-1960s. And I think you can research on this question different aspects of the EC and the relationship between Yugoslavia. First, in the beginning, the arrangements about the migrant force were regulated in the bilateral agreements, but later it was much more regulated with the EC actually, because as the EC deepened and the EC had more regulatory force, the Yugoslav authorities were more interested to deal with the EC. Then second question was actually the trade deficit, which I was talking about yesterday. Actually, the invisible receipts from the migrant force which were coming to Yugoslavia was moderating this trade deficit problem, and that is also an important segment of these relations between the EC and Yugoslavia. But in the 1970s, with the world recession, what happened that the workers got fired and got back to Yugoslavia. So again, this question has arisen in a different form, because the question was then how will Yugoslavia receive these workers, because it represented a huge social problem for Yugoslavia in the 1970s. And then there is also what I will third dimension, and it's actually the accession of Spain. Because then again there was a lot of debate in Yugoslavia about what will this mean for our migrant force. Will it again happen what happened in the 1970s, that we will receive a lot of migrant force coming back from the Western countries because of the Spanish migrant force which will move to the Western Europe. And so it's about migration from the Yugoslav point of view.
Some other comments, consideration on the migration issue? Then I would like to talk about the question of special relations that came about in these days.
Special relations between member states and some extra European countries, like Great Britain and the United States. Spain and Europe.
Another one.
Perhaps Italy and Argentina.
Do you mean if they're slowing the process of integration somehow, or?
Yeah, which is the role they are playing. Were they really effective to open Europe to the rest of the world in a coherent, coordinated way?
A little bit about France and the 50s. It wasn't exactly a correct context, but one of the things that everybody knows this is Britain, right? And almost all the French politicians, I mean, we had this image of de Gaulle. If you look at 49, 50, 51, they are obsessed. The foreign ministry and the politicians in the assembly, and most of the leaders of the parties with getting Britain into the community. So you have Schuman and some circles in the MRP which aren't as enthusiastic about that, though they have to probably show that they're putting a maximum effort into getting Britain involved. At the same time, we have the French Union, which I talked about. But the evolution through the 50s will be towards the special relationship between France and Germany, right? Which is, in some sense, the core of the European project in the early stages. So it's still a driving force of if Merkel and Sarkozy don't want to do something, it's not, or one of them doesn't want to do something, right? It's not get done. So redefining France's special relationship, right, or what is the important?
It's weird. I never thought of
Special
relationship between France and Germany. Put it that way. No, I mean it's the first time that I've heard it. It's curious.
Yeah, I heard about it, but definitely not in the beginning. I mean, it was not special. Germany has been down.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
I mean, it was not at the root. It was not at the root. Sorry, at the root of the European project, which was a French project. Definitely was not a special relationship with Germany. It was the French project to keep Germany down, and control, and check the mean.
I think he was saying 63.
So
yeah.
they can't be the goal, and most of the literature seems to confirm that it was a reaction, since we cannot have a position as a big, within the big three in NATO, like the US, Britain, and France, and so we have to turn to create a sort of US, UK in a special relationship with the US. So it does end in a sort of special couple, but usually it is definitely spelled out in that way during the Giscard years, when they call the couple. It has been the driving forces, but I will be more cautious in declaring it a special relationship.
It's not.
I guess maybe you're seeing, I don't see it special as a positive word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in that sense, Germany was not the first objective, was US getting at the same level as the US and the UK.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Even in that sense, without no necessarily positive charge, Germany was not the first object. The goal, not
So the initial
goal.
object as we
The
talked about was
goal was French foreign policy, getting at the top level with UK and the US. Then they took him to Germany.
No, it was just a quick comment. Please.
Yeah, I don't know if it's another way of thinking about this issue of special relationship that came to my head. You could consider basically all the colonial links as a special relationship of European countries with the rest of the world. And in so many ways, basically, decolonization and the increasing role of the European community is about the breakup of many of these special relationships. In so many ways, obviously, the links, oil providers, and so on and so forth, they stayed, but in so many other ways, there was a break with a time where Algeria was considered part of France. And if you think it that way, basically that Europe, the creation, the reinforcing of a European identity through a European community is about the breaking up of special relationships with non-European countries. You sort of understand also a lot of the challenges that you find yourself to confront from the 70s to today. It's about the way in which to relate yourself with the places that are I don't have an answer to this, but I would think that the prevailing attention towards the countries of the region, so whatever the region you think it is, but it could be defined as Turkey, Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, actually has been to the detriment of sort of the cooperation with the non-European world. That was the skepticism, for example, I had on your paper. I'm much more optimistic about. No, it's fine. No, but that's not important. It's the. I think a lot of places feel that those links that were so strong, maybe also in a negative sense, before the European integration came about, sort of were transforming to competition. That's a lot what different non-European areas think about Europe. It's a competitor. Maybe also to be imitated in certain things, but it's a competitor. It's not a partner. I very much doubt on all this partnership with Mediterranean countries, partnership with Latin America. In the end, when you cut the words, the reality, it's a lot about, let's exploit what we can, defend, protect ourselves from. So that would, it's just
I agree with that, and I think that all this rhetoric you were referring to in your question, dealing with this, they are the exploiters, like the colonizers, the economic exploiters, the capitalists wanting, this rhetoric is explained, specifically, this
is perhaps too specific, but has ever been in Latin American region, which is definitely heterogeneous, a kind of narrative or discourse resembling the common market, specifically in this sense, with the US, like los estómagos capitalistas in both ways, or the common market that is being perceived worse or in a better way. Because if we talk about competitors and markets and economy, economics, there might be no differences in the colonized, neo-colonized by the US or the European altogether.
I mean, so I think it's a question of looking for a counterbalance, a counterweight. So, of course, these actors try to see which is more convenient, also as an exploiter. So.
Okay. So they play one and one against the other.
Seeking for this counterbalance. I think you wanted to say something about Giuliano?
No.
Okay, that's my impression. Maybe we can move to, because we have also treated the question of post-colonial relations.
Yeah.
I don't know if somebody
Yeah,
else.
excuse me, only have 5 minutes.
Oh,
10 maybe, yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if you have some preference among these themes. Otherwise, because we also took the question of defensive relations, we also treated that, and maybe multilateralism, bilateralism, the parallel evolution of these approaches regarding European integration on external actors. Okay, then I think we also talk about the United States.
Yeah.
So, this idea of instrumental relations, so whenever you're convenient.
Aren't they all instrumental?
We want to believe they are.
Yeah, they are not, or they're not inside.
We want to believe that non-instrumental relations do exist. So,
I believe they're all instrumental one way or the other. I mean, even if you want to achieve like positive goals like deepening cultural relations, but in general they always aim at something. So, yeah, non-instrumental is not something that makes much sense to me.
for human society.
For the beauty of the world, I don't know.
Okay, some comments about that? Or no? Okay, then there was this idea of domestic politics shaping international relations, European community. Yeah. Either in outside or in member states.
My dissertation is on actually French-German relations, and I'm more and more aware of, especially in terms of EDC negotiations, but also the EDC, and well, all of them actually, is how, just because of how fractured the French Assembly is, how aware the foreign minister, Schumann, Bideau, whoever it may have been at the moment, had to be of the thin margin of parties would be like the communists and the Gaullists, right? They don't have much room to maneuver. If they lose one of the parties, or if the Socialist Party splits in the EDC or something like that, nothing will get through the Assembly. So at the same time that it really is diplomatic driven by these treaties, the domestic politics, it's certainly within France and Germany, the CDU can calm things through much easier. They get gains the absolute majority after the 53 election. So it's a different case than Germany and France.
I think on this, the tricky question is whether you think that, I mean, politics obviously has a role in foreign policy, but if you think that you cannot speak about politics if not in a national way. I am between those, but there's not so many studies on that, thinking that from the 70s there is actually the creation or the formation of a transnational political movements that play a role in certain issues, like the European Socialist Party, the European People's Party. They are not just sheds with no content. Okay, you need to study. There is a sort of consensus emerging in different families on certain issues, not obviously not on all, but you need to, I mean, increasingly you need to study what these transnational political movements say on Turkey as opposed to on immigration to understand European foreign policy. That's, I mean, I don't think there's millions of studies on these things.
Well, actually,
but slowly.
if you focus on the 70s, because transnational fraternities, let's say like that, are much older.
Yeah, that's
just think about, I don't know, the Atlantic community.
If you think the social international.
Yeah, I didn't want to just decide on the one side of the usual one. So perhaps are more developed in previous decades than the ones we used to focus. I mean, the first part of the 20th century.
I have the impression that in the 70s they focus on Europe. They really try to establish sort of institutional frameworks to focus their reasoning on European issues, while you could see that they were much more internationalist. So.
European or EC? EC?
Whatever.
Because
yeah.
When you get transnational and perhaps it's a question of which institution or entity you want to lobby and so
I would say it's DC. Yeah, at least in the Japanese case, yeah, it was because it's the EC and the European Commission that it did cause a domestic change in Japan, that we couldn't do this. And in the case of Japan and America, we had to settle another new one, the structural meetings, was it? I forgot the American name. This was made in the 80s. That it was basically about how Japan should reform by buying more from agricultural goods from America, like orange and was it beef, chicken, like that. But so to have a domestic sort of breakthrough, Japan and the American case needed to develop further of what we are going to talk about, not just the ordinary channel, but in this bilateral case, we had to make a new thing. While the Commission was so much unclear on what it was dealing about, that it just suddenly comes up to the trade union leader or whoever and comes up suddenly talking about some domestic Japanese problems and somehow or another just gets the argument through. I mean, that's complicated and complex and very difficult to understand as an outsider, but that's rather clever, I would say. Just judging from the outcome, I don't know how that worked exactly. At least if we look at the outcome, it is the EC that which causes a domestic change. Is that because it works like that in the EC or EU, or was that a diplomatic negotiation good tactic? Or I'm not sure of any of the reasons, but at least what the consequence does tell that it was the EC which could penetrate domestically. Why? I don't know.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately,
the concluding remarks there.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt because the debate was really interesting. No, I just wanted to thank you all for participating. It's the first time we organized a conference, and could have done definitely a better job. But in the end, I'm really satisfied with the outcome of these 2 days. I think your contributions were all very interesting, and the atmosphere was more than positive. So really, thank you for making this possible the way it's been.
Thank you.
Thank you.